Welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 216. And this time I'm going to talk about this tremendous album from 1957, the swinging guitar of Tal Farlow, which is this particular copy is a 1974 Japanese reissue. Tal Farlow is not much discussed today, but he's one of the greatest innovators of jazz guitar. He was self-taught, with his jazz phrasing coming after listening night after night to Charlie Parker play on saxophone on 52nd Street in the 1940s. He had huge hands, and therefore he was capable of phrasings way beyond most guitarists. I'm 6'1", my hands are, well, bigger than Trump's anyway, but his hands are a whole another thing, as you can see from this photo. He was renowned at the time, and really still today, for the speed of his playing, which probably comes, well, A, from his technical ability, but also B, from that apprenticeship of listening to Charlie Parker play jazz at lightning speeds. There are basically two phases to his career. The 1950s, when he played with a number of remarkable small jazz groups, and then retired in the early 60s to paint commercial signs, which he did until 1975, give or take, and then from 1975 until he died in 1988. This record is from the peak of that early phase of his career. Farlow was born in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1921. His dad was a guitarist, and so there were a bunch of guitars lying around at the house, but he fooled around with them a bit, didn't really take guitar playing seriously until he was in his early 20s. In the war, he was classified as unfit for duty by the selection board for reasons which are kind of obscure, and really his only professional training up until his early 20s was as a professional sign painter. He did, however, pick up the guitar in earnest after being influenced by a number of people, particularly Charlie Christian, who of course influenced so many different guitar players of the era. He of course was a guitar player for Benny Goodman. He listened to whatever jazz he could in the radio, and if it wasn't a guitar playing, he would adapt the style to the guitar. His profession as a sign painter, strangely enough, gave him the opportunity to hear a whole bunch of great jazz. North Carolina, of course, at the time was heavily segregated, and when jazz bands would come to town, they would typically play to a black audience. He would paint the signs advertising the shows, and because of that, he would manage to sneak in, and so we heard a whole bunch of great music that way. Lionel Hampton, Count Basie, basically the only white guy in the room. However, for a budding white guitarist, there were not that many opportunities in the South to play the music of his preference, so he ends up going to Philadelphia, occasionally overnight for gigs and then on a more permanent basis. This is still, of course, during World War II, and at the time there was an entertainment tax on nightclubs where there was singing and dancing. One of the unintended consequences of this was that instrumental trios got all kinds of work from club owners who didn't want to pay the tax, and so Farlow ends up getting a lot of work in Philadelphia at the time, and this is really how he learns his craft. His main early connection to the big time was with Dardanelle, a multi-instrumentalist who had played with Lionel Hampton. He started playing with her in Philadelphia, but soon enough she moved her act to the Copacabana in Manhattan, and there Farlow starts to absorb bebop like a sponge, not just Charlie Parker but also Bud Powell, all kinds of musicians, all kinds of instrumentation. He's absorbing all of it, and he's learning to think like a horn player, like a bebopper. On his own, while practicing, he learned to match these wonderful early beboppers note for note on his guitar. But he wasn't playing a lot of jazz at the time in the clubs. The work he had with Dardanelle was largely show tunes and lounges. By the late 1940s, Farlow's playing is appreciated by his circle, but he hadn't really settled on a group despite hanging around with a whole bunch of well-known players, people like Milt Jackson, the vibist, Buddy DeFranco, the clarinetist, Phil Woods, a sax player, the guitarist Mondell Lowe, and so on. These were all in his circle. But then in 1949, things changed and entered Red Norvo, a vibraphonist from California who'd played with Benny Goodman. Norvo at the time had a sextet in New York. He wanted to go back to California, but the way the music scene was on the West Coast, he couldn't actually get the bookings for a sextet. It was too big, too expensive for the club owners there. So he needed a smaller group. He decides to form up a trio in New York before he heads up to California, and the first lineup is Red Kelly on bass and Tal Farlow's friend Mondell Lowe on guitar. When Lowe found out that Norvo's plan was to go to California, he said, well, no, I can't make that move, but I'll tell you a guitarist who you might want to talk to, and that's Farlow. So Farlow joins up with Norvo and Kelly, and the three of them head out to LA, and right away they get an engagement at The Hague. They make a pretty good impression, but then Kelly decides to leave because he was basically a big band bassist, and there was an opening in Charlie Barnett's band. So now Norvo needs a bassist for his trio in a hurry. So a friend of his says, well, what about that guy that used to play bass when we toured supporting Billie Holiday back in San Francisco? Maybe he's still around. So anyway, Norvo gets hold of this guy. It turns out that he's delivering letters, but would like a gig playing bass. And so that's how Charles Mingus comes to join this trio. Despite the kind of unplanned way in which this group came together, the Red Norvo Trio, this early version of it, is one of the great small jazz combos in history. If you're interested in listening to that group, and I totally recommend it, probably the best place to start is with this album, Move, with this outrageously cool cover, which is a compilation of a couple of 10 inches which were put out in 51 and 53 and is basically the best of their stuff. Sadly, this group comes to a sudden end just before they're about to make their first TV appearance. Now, the reasons why are disputed and controversial. Norvo and Farlow say it was because Mingus didn't have a union card. Mingus says it was because the TV producers told Norvo that he could not have a racially integrated group on television and therefore he had to bring in a different bassist. Either way, Mingus walked right out of the studio and the three of them never performed together again. A little while later, Farlow had a hand injury which put him out of action for a while, so he left the group as well. When he returned to playing, it was back in New York, not on the West Coast. Farlow puts out an album as a leader for Blue Note. He also did several LPs for Norgran Records, and he plays a little bit with Artie Shaw. In 1955, Farlow had left Shaw's band and he'd gone back out to LA to try his luck there when he gets a call from a guy called Cy Barron, who owned the Composers Club in Manhattan on 58th. Barron wanted to know if Tal would come back to New York and take up a residency at his club along with a young piano player called Eddie Costa. Farlow agrees and he comes back to New York, and between them, Barron and Farlow bring in a third player, a guy called Vinnie Burke, bassist. Between them, Farlow, Burke, and Costa made 3 LPs, Tal in 1956, This is Tal Farlow in 1958, and between those two, sandwiched the swinging guitar of Tal Farlow in 1957. The record's actually recorded in May 1956. Of course, it includes Farlow on guitar, Costa on piano, and Burke on bass. The record's produced by Norman Granz, who's quite a significant figure in the world of music production in the middle part of the 20th century. He's from LA. Prior to World War II, he'd actually been in the stock market, but he gets drafted into the Air Force, and he finds his way into so-called morale branch, which was basically responsible for finding ways to entertain the troops, think Bob Hope and so on. And through this, he learns a lot about things he didn't know about before, like putting on shows, musicians, and so on. And he puts these new areas of knowledge to work after he's demobilized after the war. In particular, once he was back in LA, he starts to organize something called Jazz at the Philharmonic. This started off as a one-time concert, which becomes a 40-year run of concerts, records, tours, all the way across the United States, introducing jazz to all kinds of different locations and different people and really spreading the gospel. He also started his own record company in 1953, Norgran Records. I mentioned that Farlow had recorded several LPs for him, I think 4 in total. He produced something like 450 records in his career, which is a phenomenal total. This is quite early on in that streak, but he does really well, I think, in capturing, in particular, the round tones of Farlow's guitar. I'm not sure the piano gets such good treatment, but overall, the sound of this record is pretty good. Side 1 starts with Taking a Chance on Love, which is a great start. We've got Farlow's speed and really the wonderful sound, the tone that he managed to conjure up, wonderfully captured here. The other thing which is quite clear is that the trio have now had about a year and a half to play together and they are really locked in. Yardbird Suite follows, and this of course is Charlie Parker's showpiece and a good example of how Farlow had taken Parker's work and transposed it to guitar. As you might expect, this is quite a reverential treatment, given the months that Farlow spent basically right there at Parker's feet listening to him play, but it's also probably Costa's best moment on the record as well. It's flashy, but a very rhythmic piece of playing. Another standard, You Stepped Out of a Dream follows, and this is super impressive by Farlow. It's a party piece. He just roars through this at very, very high speed. The final track on the first side is They Can't Take That Away From Me by Gershwin. It's a pretty elastic interpretation of the main theme by Farlow. I found this probably the most disjointed arrangement on the record. Side 2 starts with Like Someone in Love, which if you wanted to be less than charitable, you could say it's a kind of hard bop, sort of comfortable, probably provokes ultimately the avant-garde. It's not a low point by any stretch of the imagination. The playing is wonderful, but it's just, as I say, kind of comfortable. A track called Meteor follows, and there's much more energy on this particular track. It's the sole original by Farlow. He and Costa are jousting all the way through, and Costa adds all these fills, which totally make the track, in my opinion. The final track is Cole Porter's I Love You, which is a brilliant interpretation, once again with Farlow and Costa just knocking each other out, and Burke nailing the rhythm. It's sometimes difficult for an instrumental trio to maintain interest over 2 sides of an LP, but this is not a problem here. The talent of the 2 main soloists is pretty much beyond question, but I think the real hidden star of this record is Burke, who, in a drumless group, turns in one of the most solidly rhythmic performances I think you're ever going to hear and really creates a lot of freedom for the other players. I never think Farlow was the tidiest player. I think that probably comes with being so quick, but he's a risk taker, and to me, that trade-off is more than worth it. This is one of his most enduring outings, and it's a must for any fan of jazz guitar. I give it 4.5 out of 5 stars.